Um, my name's Tony Goldner. I'm the Executive Director of the TNFD Secretariat, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. A great pleasure to have those of you with us here in person and also those who are online as well. We have a fantastic panel today, getting the perspectives on nature-related risk from stock exchanges around the world, Singapore, Johannesburg, ICE from New York and London. We have an online audience as well, live streaming. But before I hand over the microphone to Margaret, who's going to facilitate and moderate this discussion for us, I just wanted to give you a couple of quick updates from the TNFD before we get started. And first of all, let me thank WWF for hosting us. WWF are one of our core founding partners and founders of the TNFD. And we're delighted to be really working closely with the WWF team on a number of fronts. And Margaret is a member of our Stewardship Council as well. So delighted by the partnership that we have with the team at WWF globally. So for those of you who maybe are less familiar with TNFD, the task force was set up to essentially bring nature into the financial reporting that companies are doing on their financial statements and increasingly alongside their reporting on climate. And so TNFD, as the name would suggest, has been inspired by TCFD. We're working outwards from the TCFD approach, but of course nature is different in many respects to climate. And the task force is hard at work in figuring out how do we best enable companies and financial institutions to think about their exposure to nature-related risk, and in so doing also help stem the loss of nature that's happening around the world. So ultimately this outcome should be good for the planet and also good for business and finance by lowering their risk and making them more resilient going forward. The approach that we've taken to our work is very much an open innovation approach. We're doing this with the market, not for the market. So the task force is market-led, but we are supported by government. We're backed by the science, and so we have a complex set of stakeholders around us to help us develop the TNFD framework. Our timeline, we are working towards having our final recommendations out by September next year. And we are releasing the framework in stages, so it's sort of evolving over time. And last Friday we released the third update of the framework. So I'd encourage you all to have a look on our website for the most recent release of the framework. And as I mentioned, we're market-led, science-based, and supported by government and philanthropy. So today I'm really excited to be able to announce a few expansions of the task force's activity on all three of those dimensions. So the first thing is we're expanding the task force from 34 to 40 members. We're announcing this today. And I'm really delighted to say that we're deepening and broadening the experience of the task force across sectors and geographies. And we're bringing on board 7 new task force members today. Acciona in the infrastructure and renewable energy space, Bayer, the US chemicals company, German chemicals company, Dow, LVMH from the fashion and consumer goods space, Norinchiken Bank from Japan, Reckitt, the consumer goods company, and Swire Properties from Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. So this is really going to expand our ability to look at the implications of the framework across sectors. Until now, we have not had task force members with that type of sector experience in those particular industries, so this is a really important and strategic moment to be bringing on board that extra capability. Today, we're also expanding our knowledge partnership network. We are bringing on board Nature Finance, previously known as Finance for Biodiversity. They have been very involved in the TNFD's work now for 2 years since inception, so this is really a formalization of long-standing support and input from the Nature Finance team. And we're also bringing on board the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo, and we're really delighted to be having stronger support from Professor Naoko Ishii and her team at the University of Tokyo, who've been doing a lot of work on these issues for many, many years. And we've got tremendous interest in the framework in Japan. So this is also going to be a great way to bring in more Japanese perspective and expertise into our task force. And finally, I'm really delighted to announce today that we've got an additional strategic funding partner joining us from the MacDoc Foundation in Australia, and delighted to have Alistair and Michelle with us here today. And so we're expanding our resources, our knowledge, and our task force expertise on the TNFD today. And MacDoc is really interesting for us, not only because of the generous funding support, but they've been doing some really pioneering work on agribusiness transformation in Australia, which we're already benefiting from in terms of our agricultural sector view of the work. So just quickly, I mentioned we released the latest framework last Friday. The framework is essentially got three core elements to it. At the foundational level is a set of core concepts and definitions drawn from the best available science. So we're very much grounded in the work of IPBES and the support of other scientific bodies like IUCN, Stockholm Resilience Centre and others is really the scientific underpinning of our work. The market participants told us that nature is incredibly new for them. Everyone is immersed in the climate journey at the moment, getting to net zero. Most organisations don't have in-house expertise on nature, and so there was a very clear request when we started our work. Don't just tell us what to disclose in our financial statements, you need to help us understand how to bring nature into our enterprise and portfolio risk management process. So in addition to the disclosures, we've also developed a risk management approach so that companies and financial institutions can actually start building this into their existing risk management processes. So we've got definitions, the risk assessment, advice, and then the disclosures at the top. And around that is a set of guidance on how to use this in different contexts and different sectors. In the release that we put out last Friday, we've included some really important additions to the framework. So after a year of work, we've now examined and incorporated impact on nature and the relevant disclosures that we think are necessary in terms of impact on nature, as well as impact on the enterprise. So that's probably the most significant new addition to the framework that came out last week. And we've also incorporated, in addition to the TCFD disclosures, new disclosures on supply chain traceability, the quality of stakeholder engagement, and the alignment of climate and nature targets. And we think these are all really important and additional elements on top of what the market is now working on from a climate perspective. Of course, these are particular issues to the nature context. Nature impacts and risks are local. So we have to work through the complexity of supply chains if we're really trying to drive action and lower the risk profile to business. It's no point for the big consumer goods and food manufacturers who put the goods on our supermarket being involved if they're not also pulling through all of the companies that supply them with their goods in their supply chains. So that's where we're up to. There's lots to have a look at on our website, including a new discussion paper on scenarios and also on the societal considerations that we need to be considering. But let me turn the floor to Margaret so we can get into this conversation with our partners from stock exchanges around the world. So Margaret, over to you.
Hello. Thank you very, very much, Tony, for the introduction and the summary of the work that the TNFD has been doing so far. Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for those of you just joining us. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you here to the Panda Pavilion, as we call it today. We are obviously hosting Finance Day, like everyone else here at the COP, but it's also a special day here in the Panda Pavilion. We're hosting a number of events focused on Africa in particular. So here in our pavilion today, it's also Africa Day. And I can't think of a better combination of finance and Africa and the discussion that we're going to have this morning. So first I want to introduce my panelists and then we'll turn to a discussion. Elizabeth King is the president of the Intercontinental Stock Exchange. She's the head of sustainable finance and the product initiative around sustainable investing. In this role, she also oversees the New York Stock Exchange Board Advisory Council, which works with the CEOs of the NYSE-listed firms to identify diverse candidates for boards of directors for venture-funded and newly public companies, so all around the ESG wheel. And as the Intercontinental Exchange's regulatory officer, she oversees the company's global regulatory and government affairs initiatives as well. Nice to have you here, Elizabeth. Shamila Ibrahim is the CSO for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer, also responsible for advising the Executive Committee and the board of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange on sustainability integration into strategy. She's responsible for the FTSE JSE Responsible Investment Index Series and the immediate past chair of the World Federation of Exchanges Sustainability Working Group. She's also a member of the strategy group for Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, or GISD. Adrian, next, is the Director of Sustainable Finance at the London Stock Exchange Group, where his work ranges from education on best practices in ESG and climate disclosure to financing the transition and scaling green economy companies and funds. At LSEG, he works with the group's capital markets and post-trade businesses to define and implement their sustainable finance strategy. He also helped establish ABN AMRO's environmental markets business back in 2006, so he's been at this for quite a while, and was the head of the international certification body Gold Standard, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, where he led also the development of carbon markets, impact finance models for deploying clean technologies and sustainable land use, and again, all around the SDG wheel. So great to have you here, Adrian. Last but not least, Harry Cho, who's also a member of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. She's the managing director of the Singapore Stock Exchange. She's also head of sustainability, sustainable finance, or you joined as the head of sustainable finance back in February. She drives the Singapore Stock Exchange Sustainability and Sustainable Finance Strategic Direction with the aim of transforming the exchange and the whole ecosystem into a world-class, trusted, multi-asset sustainability exchange. In her previous role as head of sustainable finance for APAC at ING Bank, she was a pioneer in the development of sustainable finance markets in Asia Pacific. So it's really a pleasure to have you here as well. And I'm looking forward to a truly global conversation on what the exchanges are doing on sustainability. Harry, I want to come to you first. Just explain a little bit, we'll come around to everyone first, just explain a little bit, why do you as a stock exchange care about sustainability? And after we go through that, I'm going to come back to you specifically on your experience as a member of the TNFD. So why do stock exchanges care about sustainability?
Oh, that's a simple one, Margaret. I mean, look, there's 20,000 people here today. We're all working in some way in climate change. This is the theme of our times, more broadly on sustainability. Stock exchanges, so exchanges in general, because there's many different types of asset classes. We are at the heart of the ecosystem. We have the influence and, to an extent, the power to influence the market and work with the market in order to steer the theme that we must influence in the broader ecosystem and embed it into our existing capital system, especially from finance perspective. And so for us, this is a key priority, and hence we are putting numerous different types of resources across as a company, for the business, as a regulator, and for the ecosystem.
Thank you. That gives a very good sense for the range of issues that you deal with, for sure. Adrian, why do you care about this at LSEG?
I think at its heart, this is about what stock exchanges, as originally defined, were about. It was bringing those with capital together with those who are in need of capital to achieve an end game. And if you're to make that work, you need trust, and you need transparency, and you need those with capital to believe that the returns they're expecting are going to be made. Now, increasingly, those returns are driven by the ability of companies to manage risk associated with climate and nature-based issues. And in order to assess that, they're going to need data. So our focus on sustainability is really about making capital markets work properly to help ensure they're understanding risk effectively, and that the investors can treat a market as a quality place to do business. More broadly now, of course, exchanges are much bigger. We're working through our data business with pension funds, creating indexes. And again, investors want to be able to adjust those for their own perspectives and hypotheses around what's going to take place relating to climate and nature-based risk. And so we need data to be able to provide the tools that they want to invest effectively for the future generations.
Thanks. We'll come back more on the data question in particular. Shamila, give us the perspective on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Why are you so focused on sustainability?
Thanks, Margaret. So I think my colleagues have sketched it out. Always hard to follow after two speakers. So certainly in addition to what has already been said, which we completely support, at the heart of it, I think, is for us saying, how do we help create an enabling environment for better sustainability practices and disclosure to grow? So sustainability in relation to our context is front and center of the context in which we operate in. I mean, we're in a country where social issues, environmental issues have really been part and parcel of how you do business for the longest time. And so when we think about that, it's not something far-fetched. We see the risks, but we also see the opportunities emanating in the market. But if we are going to also help ensure the long-term investment proposition of the market, then it's critical that we start considering these factors and actively work to create that enabling environment for better practices to grow. So that's where we see it at. We see it as part and parcel of actually creating that future that we want to retire into ultimately. So the bigger picture is to say all of this needs to fit together for what? And that vision is something that you and I want to retire into. So regardless of what that return is on that pension fund invested in that market, what is it actually buying? And what you want is not a future that is really, disrupted by climate change, social issues and the like. And so using the markets as a force to be able to actually achieve that objective is what we're looking at.
That's good. Thank you for bringing in the social issues as well. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Elizabeth, let me turn to you. And what's your perspective on sustainability? And maybe we'll start with a separate, slightly more directed question. We hear a lot in the press about the challenges in the U.S. context, especially about ESG. So as you talk about, the interest in pushing forward on sustainability or not, what's your interest in sustainability now?
So Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE, where I work, owns the New York Stock Exchange. And in addition to the comments of the other panelists, I'd add that sustainability is important to the 2,400 listed companies of the NYSE, and so it's important to us. This is something that the range of companies, if you think about 2,400 companies, they are at various stages of their ESG journey. Some of them are very well developed, generally the larger companies, and others are really only beginning it. So we feel that we're in a position to provide tools in the form of data and other tools, education and training to our companies to help them as they establish their own strategies around sustainability and ESG.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. You have to hold the microphones very close so that everyone in here can hear. It's a very energetic day here, Finance Day at the COP. Harry, I want to turn to you now specifically on the TNFD. So you are a member of the task force, and Tony actually, when he presented the most recent version in a webinar of the beta release, talked about this offsite that the TNFD members had. And it's hard to understate how much work has been done basically remotely, because this initiative began during COVID. So these teams were pulling together to do an extensive amount of work very quickly. You've become very close Zoom friends, I know. But talk about what this means as a member of the task force, what this development has looked like for you, and what are some of the inspirations or the new realizations that came out of the conversations that you were able to have in person for the first time?
Sure. I mean, first of all, we cannot thank the TNFD Secretariat enough. the amount of load that they have been carrying on behalf of the 34 until the announcement that Tony just made has been tremendous. There's no way we would have gotten out the third version of the beta framework if not. Now, when we think about nature, so when we first started, it was really hard to grasp what does financial related disclosure around nature actually even mean? And how should we even frame this? And so there was key components that were important and that were rediscussed in the 2-day offsite that we had just last month. So number one was disclosure frameworks, just in general for sustainability, is difficult as it is. So we must make it aligned and easy to follow as much as possible with the existing frameworks. And therefore, it was reinforced in the latest framework that in overall TCFD framework would be followed. There were also further discussions on how TNFD can further align and work together with, for example, ISSB. So it will not be working standalone. That is the first point in making this practical in terms of implementation in the future. Secondly, we think that the diversity of the voices of the 40 task force members, or 34 until very recently, was absolutely tremendously important. Because people were coming from European perspective, from Asian perspective, US perspective, other global south perspectives, to truly ensure that we have a framework that can be globally used. So what that meant was, it is going to be an adaptable and a flexible approach. So for example, there would be the core standards and there will be enhanced standards. And there would be components, even topics such as materiality. We're not going to be terming it that way when we talk about TNFD. But what came out very clear is there are going to be different jurisdictional approaches to sustainability reporting. And therefore, when it comes to nature, make it adaptable so that it can look at, for example, focus more on the financial evaluation side, but you can also look at the impact on the environment of the businesses or the financial institutions as well. So that adaptable approach is something that we think is going to be key to making this a success, and there were huge amounts of discussion around that. And I must admit, when we first launched and set out pilots already of sort of beta versions of these frameworks from quite early on, there was a little bit of discomfort, especially from some companies who are regulated spaces like financial institutions, where we don't put something out until things are quite well cooked. Well, what we have found over the period of last 12 months or so is that piloting was very important, because whether people liked it, whether there was a strong reaction for the positive or negative, we heard it. And therefore, we were able to embed that into the framework by design, take that into account, and then ensure that it is something that others actually want to implement. And then finally, for this to be roadmapped over time, we have to give companies time to actually adopt these. So these are some of the key components that were discussed.
You're the only exchange among the TNFD members. You talked about the diversity of both geographic and sectoral and corporate. What was it like being the exchange in the conversation? How much translation or interpretation had to happen across those various sectors, geographies, and of course you've got the corporate perspective and the finance perspective.
Yeah. So what I felt that I was humbly able to contribute to the discussion was, by nature, I had to contribute to systemic thinking, because that's what exchanges do. So every single comment that was being made was about how will this work in the system. And secondly, just having had the practical experience, having rolled out mandatory sustainability reporting regimes, both on general sustainability reporting mandatory regime in 2016, as well as climate-related disclosure that started as a mandatory basis from this financial year. It was actually, giving some of that practical steering that this might work, this may not work, this is how we should look at things to ensure that it actually is implementable and practical.
Thanks. Adrian, you mentioned before the focus on data. And I think one of the pieces that's still being developed in the TNFD context is the data and metrics, because it's extremely complicated, and there are a lot of partners in that data and metrics development, including, as Tony mentioned, IPBES, which is the sort of biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC. So you are at the London Stock Exchange. Obviously, you're quite focused on data, and for a long time, is TNFD going to be helpful? I hear there's just not enough data for companies to do nature-related disclosure.
I think that we're both awash with data and lacking it. And the reality is it's about getting a critical mass of disclosure in a consistent format. And only when you have that can you really start to compare companies' performance, understand whether they're managing risk in the ways that investors and policymakers want to see. I think that the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges with TNFD, is that there is a lack of broad data to benchmark against, and there's a lack of scientific data, particularly in areas like oceans, to be able to really understand the issues to a thorough degree. And of course, that will come over time as more people disclose, as more effort goes into looking at those gaps. We will be able to enhance and expect more of those companies disclosing. But I think it's important to look at getting going, right? In the early days of TCFD, the same could have been said. The benefit of TCFD is companies are used to, or increasingly used to, disclosing in a structured way. And a lot of the risks that come out of climate-related issues are nature-based inherently because of the impact of climate on nature and therefore the ecosystems in which companies operate. So I think we've both got a problem because there's a lack of scientific data in certain areas, but a benefit in terms of structure of data and in terms of the understanding that's gone into where are the risks in my business associated with climate, if that impacts on water supplies or availability of resources, etc. I think the other thing then is for users of the data to understand what it is they're trying to achieve with it. So the use cases become incredibly important. And to avoid or mitigate against criticism that we see in climate disclosure and in ESG ratings, I think we need to really be clear about those use cases to civil society and indeed to the media as well, because often we see criticisms of the way that scoring takes place, and yet actually it's thinking about the way that investors are using the data and what it's for is going to be really critical. So if we can get those messages across around where we are, be transparent about where the gaps are, but also what the direction of travel is and how different organizations, investors, and governments are using that data, I think that'd be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, thank you. The use case is a very important point. Thank you for that. So, Shamila, we heard Harry talk about the diversity of voices in the conversation and a conversation that was trying to balance frameworks that are already in place, some places where there are no frameworks. Give us your perspective in South Africa. So there's a very different conversation, I imagine, around sustainability. And a lot of these initiatives have been led from the leadership out of the EU on the sustainable finance taxonomy. How does that conversation land for you, and how does it look different? And then what's your role as the stock exchange in sort of pushing the development, the further development of these sustainability disclosures and the sustainability target setting by corporates?
So Margaret, I think one of the clear indications of where our role could be has emerged in the last few years. So, and so it became clear, I think particularly I would say over the last 2 years, where I've been getting calls from a number of companies saying, this space is getting really confusing. What should we be doing? How should this work? And the thing is, we've actually got a history of good disclosure in South Africa. FTSE did a survey for us a year ago, or about a year and a half ago, looking at all the companies that they look at globally on ESG disclosure. And we were number 5 in the world for highest average ESG score, which is quite, substantial. Considering it's an emerging market, it's stacked up against bigger markets and things like that. So the practices have been there. It's actually a country where a lot of this has been developed over many years, and you can see the fruits of that now. But even with that, in the last 2 years, I've seen a number of companies come forth and say, this is really getting confusing, huge amounts of confusion with all the framework standards, convergence happening here, possible divergence happening when you look at, EU's approach versus ISSB's approach, those kinds of things. So what we did is we said, how can we help without adding to the confusion? And so this year in June, we actually issued a sustainability disclosure guidance as well as climate change disclosure guidance. And what it was doing was saying, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we want to answer to these challenges that our companies are facing. What was also significant is that you've got your larger companies, probably your sort of top 100 size, who are perhaps more advanced in their efforts and have the resources and managing their sustainability reporting. But we've got a big tail after that, of companies who want to do this, who've been asked questions by investors, who've been asked questions by civil society, but are struggling and don't have the funds to pay consultants to get on board to do this quickly for them. So that's where we really wanted to focus our effort. And so our guidance was really to try to say, how do we create that understanding, give them a good sense of what's happening, differences, questions like difference between ESG and sustainability, and often how these terms are being confused. What does that mean? Concepts like understanding planetary boundaries and things like that. So we brought some of that education into the guidance, and now we're going to be supporting with understanding how to apply the guidance as well. And what we've also done is tried to move away from a kind of ESG risk management tick box approach towards an impact and outcome driven approach. So I think when Tony was speaking about TNFD now looking at saying, now how do you that link to the impact on the environment, that's exactly what I think we've entrenched. And not to wade into the debates between what's happening with ISSB or whatever, but double materiality, for example, has been something that's been part and parcel of our governance discourse in our country forever. So it's almost unnatural. But why is this even a question? So we come from a different starting point, I think. But that's where we're seeing it, is like, what is that impact? How do you start thinking about that? And how do you create those systems and the mechanisms to make sense of this and own your narrative so that you're not kind of swayed by a whole lot of different frameworks? You understand the building blocks, the governance that's required, and that is set up. So regardless of maybe how you need to tailor perhaps to different audience needs, your fundamentals are going to be strong. You understand how you've integrated the thinking into your business model, and it's quite clear then how that model is evolving to meet future needs. So that's kind of the approach we've taken, Margaret, and we're hoping that that is going to be helpful to our companies.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good illustration of the point that Harry made earlier about the role of exchanges in the systems conversation, right?
Completely.
Which I think, which maybe is sometimes lost, or maybe not as obvious as it really is. So thanks for that. Mm-hmm. So Elizabeth, I want to come to you and ask about this great stuff I've read about it in the press, and I'm very excited to see if it works. The Natural Asset Company. One of the questions that I get really frequently when I attend panels and go to events is people say, yes, we understand green bonds, we've got investment instruments at scale in the debt market. When are we going to get investment instruments at scale in the equities market? So when are we going to see a natural asset company, and what is it?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, so thank you. If you could put this slide up, would be helpful. So natural asset companies are a really interesting and innovative equity instrument that the New York Stock Exchange is currently talking to the SEC about listing standards that have been developed in partnership with the Intrinsic Exchange Group. So to kind of step back a little bit, we all know that healthy ecosystems provide clean air and water, they foster biodiversity, they regulate the climate, and ultimately they provide the food on which our existence depends. So these crucial natural processes are called ecosystem services. And in aggregate, they are estimated to generate more than $100 trillion of value per year and serve as the foundation to support more than half of global GDP. So advances in climate disclosure and environmental markets are improving investors' ability to understand and manage the risks and the negative externalities of industrial production and the emissions that they create. But there's also an opportunity to quantify and support the positive externalities that are created by preserving and restoring of natural landscapes. So these, we all understand and are generally familiar with traditional corporations. They use the markets to raise capital, to fund their own development, and to grow their businesses. And similarly, ecosystems are productive assets, and they can be actively managed to increase their performance and their outputs over time. So just like a traditional company, an equity market-based solution can be established for natural capital. So as I mentioned, New York Stock Exchange has partnered with Intrinsic Exchange Group to launch a new class of equity security called natural asset companies, or NACs. And these NACs will be listed on the NYSE. They will hold the rights to ecosystem services that are produced in a designated natural, working, or hybrid area. The NAC would license the rights to these ecosystem services from the asset owner. It's very similar to a run with the land right, such as air rights or water rights. And the goal of these NACs, each NAC, would be to increase the health and the productivity of the assets through active management. The natural asset companies would largely have the same listing standards as other companies, operating companies on the New York Stock Exchange, with a few notable exceptions, a few notable differences. The capital that's raised by a NAC would be used to implement conservation plans or otherwise maximize the ecological performance of the assets. The NACs would be prohibited from conducting extractive development, such as mining or timber harvesting. And importantly, the NACs would be required to establish an equitable benefits sharing policy that ensures that local stakeholders participate in the economic value of the NAC, as well as they'll also be required to have a biodiversity and environmental and social policy. And finally, in addition to standard financial statements, each NAC would be required to produce statements of ecological performance that measure the productivity, value, and health of the natural landscapes that are licensed and managed by the NAC. So we're very excited about this opportunity. We're actively and constructively working with the SEC, and pending their approval, we hope to welcome NACs over the coming years.
Thanks. This is a very interesting development, and in a lot of these conversations we hear these challenges of how you actually get the financial resources to the local place where the assets are. So how do you solve that problem? How do we get the money to the ground where indigenous peoples live, where local communities are the stewards of the local assets?
So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of different ways that this is being done. I think that the interesting thing about the natural asset companies is that it allows investment through an equity instrument, and that the markets can value these critical services, these ecosystem services, in a way through the market. So in that way, the manager, the company that is managing these assets, will be able to get funding from the larger public, from the marketplace, and that will go directly to managing and preserving and restoring these assets. It is important that the indigenous people, as you mentioned, and the social impacts are taken into account, and that is why one of the requirements in the listing standards will be to have this type of policy around making sure that the local stakeholders participate in the economic value that is generated by the NAC.
Yeah, Adrian, you want to come in on this? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think what this is a really interesting example of is the role that exchanges can play in driving innovation in financial markets, because of the central role we play within this. And I think natural asset companies is a really interesting concept. It's a way of rethinking what a company can be, and I think that's, and what its ultimate goals are. But it also complements really a lot of the work we're doing in other areas. So complementary to that is sort of things like voluntary carbon markets. Obviously, a lot of the focus of high quality projects is that they drive wider social and environmental benefits through the process of implementing an activity, whether it's land-based or whether it's community-based. We recently launched a designation for funds that will invest into climate projects. And the way that we approached that was to say, well, fund structures are great at things like renewable financing. Some of the largest are now market capitalizations of over £2 billion. And how can we? But a lot of the focus of those funds is on Europe and on the US and in Australia. How do we make sure they can actually be beneficial to the global south? And that was sort of the exam question the CEO of the stock exchange asked us, was to say, well, how can we direct capital in these areas? We've taken the approach of looking at carbon markets and saying, okay, well, what beyond the current listing requirements and disclosure requirements of funds would we need to be comfortable and get the right level of transparency and disclosure within carbon markets? So we've created an extra layer of rules for companies that seek that designation, or funds as well, to say they need to disclose to a much greater extent what they're doing, how they're going about it, what standards they're using, how they'll demonstrate success against those, etc. And I think that the way that those activities, which largely take place in the global south, but funded through investments by pension funds and indeed companies in the Western world, I think can be incredibly helpful. But what both parties need is trust that the right care is being taken around implementing these projects, the right outcomes are being delivered, and that's just as important for the investors as it is for the communities in which those projects take place. So I think by the way that we collectively innovate, how complementary those things are, you could easily see carbon activities sitting within a net, for example, I think is really helpful. So the dialogue we have as a group is vital.
Yeah, if you pass the mic to Harry, thanks.
Yeah, so I think, Margaret, you hit the nail in the head when you said, how do you ensure the money goes to the specific locations where the money is needed? How do we make this a climate finance that actually works, right, and funds on the ground? So when we think about that, I'll touch upon it from TNFD perspective, also from the carbon markets perspective. When it comes to TNFD, there was, unanimous decision almost that the climate issue needs to be tied to the nature issue, and that's why even the disclosure standards should be tied as much as possible. And the fact that the key difference being that for nature, it is very location specific, whereas in climate you have one global P&L, right, if you'd like. So how do you make this location specific? Now, when it comes to carbon markets, so I've got my colleague from Climate Impact X in the room as well. So one of the key things that we looked at when we thought about rolling out carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, is number one, co-benefits. So yes, you have to look at climate change mitigation, but what are the other benefits that a carbon credit brings? Whether that be to the society and the community or biodiversity, and these need to be captured and priced as much as possible. Then number two, how do you make sure that those standards are indeed the quality of the carbon credits actually do what they say it will do, what it says on the tin? So these are some of the factors that Climate Impact X has been really closely trying to look at to ensure that whatever credit gets bought, that money actually goes to the specific locations with the benefits that it says on the tin. So yeah, the location specificity and making sure the funding goes there and the focus on the 360 perspective is absolutely critical.
Now, you're all talking about extending disclosures in your markets. Shamila, you gave a great example of how this is maybe a little bit obvious. It's been, especially the governance questions, right, in the South Africa context, this has been on the agenda for quite some time. Who's driving the demand for these disclosures? in each of your markets? Is it the same drivers? Do you have different drivers? Is it, are you looking at the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Action Plan? Is it regulatory? What's the driver?
Shall I go first? Okay. In our market, we're certainly seeing an increase in investors, firstly, asking those questions. So investor interest is certainly one of the big factors there. Another one is a very interesting rise in civil society awareness and activism. And then at the same time, coupled with that is the requirement for is closer scrutiny on disclosures. What haven't you told us? The questions that people are asking, or you haven't told us enough of this. So we're seeing those as two very key factors. The other one I think also is regulatory. In our market, we have a number of multinational companies who are globally exposed. So as long as they have operations in other jurisdictions, what's happening there is going to impact them because those requirements are going to flow down the line. So there is that perspective of you're operating there, you need to comply with what is being requested in that jurisdiction. And then tied to the investor one, of course, is a slightly different angle, which is the fact that we're a country that receives a fair amount of foreign direct investment, right, from other jurisdictions. And so the regulations in those jurisdictions that are now starting to effectively govern that money is going to then flow down. So we're going to have the extraterritorial impact of what those investors want in our jurisdiction. So there's the local investment part, absolutely, who is very aware of the sustainability challenges and therefore now asking a lot more questions about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then there's that element of the international flows that are going to be impacted by what's happening in those jurisdictions and sort of the money governing those investor flows as well. So we're seeing those as the key pressures, I think, as well. Part of it also is the greenwashing generally and the concerns around greenwashing, and how does one start mitigating the concerns around greenwashing. And so, again, this closer scrutiny on how you're disclosing, what you're using as a proxy or the benchmark to really give credibility to what you're saying. Those are the main drivers, I'd say, Margaret. Thank you.
So investors, civil society, global investors, and global regulatory regimes that sort of flow down, cascade down through markets, and maybe the companies themselves, because the more disclosure you have, the more companies can demonstrate that they're not greenwashing.
Absolutely. It's becoming a foundation for building trust, more and more. Outside of the pure financial information, is this how do we build trust in what you're doing? And so disclosures that you can depend on, that are credible, are going to be a big part of being able to bridge the trust divide.
Yeah, I see a lot of head nodding. It seems like the same. Anything different? Go ahead, Adrian.
I think not different. I think that, but it's about, just to come back to the carbon markets thing, it's quite interesting. It was, one of the challenges with carbon markets is an ongoing lack of trust between different parties around whether these things actually make a difference. And so the ability of an exchange to set rules around these things is very helpful. And I think you do require rules. Voluntary disclosure will only get you so far. So what we see investor pressure. We see civil society pressure, and that's leading to companies wanting to disclose and collectively wanting to disclose in similar ways so that they can be compared, and in their view, usually because they feel they compare favourably. But actually, voluntary disclosure alone doesn't work. If you look at the amount of companies that disclose on climate still, scope 1 and 2 emissions, so the large and mid-cap firms globally disclosing scope 1 and 2 emissions, it's about 42% worldwide. Right, and that's an area where we think we're pretty advanced. So, and there's a lot of regional disparity within that, and there are reasons for that. But I think it's important to highlight that the momentum that we create through these frameworks like TNFD, and the adoption rates that we get, that we need the users of that data to continue to demand better, more consistent, and more broad disclosures, and then we need policymakers to get on the back of that, because it's only really when the laggards start to see that regulation will be coming that they start to get engaged. So we need a combination of all of those things to really make things work properly.
Yeah, I want to come around to everybody. This question on voluntary versus regulatory. Did you want to come in on that last one first?
Yeah, I think it is most of our listed companies. The driver is from the most listed companies in the U.S. The drivers are investors. That is who has been pushing it, and more recently, because they are also the asset owners and the asset managers that are really pushing the public companies to disclose this information and to develop their own transition plans and their own targets. The more recently, because they have business operations in other parts of the world that have more developed regulatory structures, that is driving how they do it and the standards that they're using in order to disclose. But the pressure is still coming from shareholders to actually do it. I think it will be, the between the voluntary and the regulatory. There's going to be a limit on the regulatory side in the U.S. because there's so many private companies that are suppliers. And that is going to be very hard to require them to, in any regulatory framework, to actually disclose. But there are some initiatives on the voluntary basis. I think there were, around from the general partners and the limited partners, the large private equity and venture capital firms, to develop standards and requirements around disclosure by these private companies, which I think will move things along.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask that follow-up question. I appreciate you covering that. So how long, but why don't you keep the mic for a sec? How long is it going to take to go from voluntary to regulatory? And if we, part of when we had these early discussions about the Task Force on Nature-related financial disclosure, we, on purpose, incorporated some of the regulators into the forum to try to shorten that time, taking the TCFD experience into mind. How do you shorten that time between voluntary and regulatory? In the U.S. case, what's your guess? How long will it take before some of these disclosure requirements are mandatory? Understanding how much of that you actually control or not.
Right. Well, I assure you, I control none of it. But that's really a political question. And I will not predict the politics of when this is going to become a regulatory requirement. I really have no idea. And I don't think it matters that much. I feel as if this train has left the station. The private sector has taken the initiative, and there continues to be momentum around expanding the disclosures and the target setting. So I don't know that it really matters when the regulators catch up.
And what about in South Africa? How long before the TNFD disclosure framework is a regulatory matter?
I have no idea how long that might take, Margaret. It's not an easy one, but I think perhaps there's a bigger conversation happening in the country because we need to have an harmonious approach to mandatory disclosure across the board. You can't kind of just say you impose it only on listed companies. There's a whole level playing field consideration around that as well. And I think that consideration about what is the requirements in the country, what is the need from a sustainability perspective, what are the risks that they're facing, therefore what is appropriate, therefore which sectors, what kind of disclosure, SMEs versus large companies. So there's a lot that needs to really be thought through to come up with a framework that seems equitable and that is, it is meaningful in the way it's rolled out and appropriate. So that I think could take time. The unknowns that will factor into that would be, not the known unknowns, should I say, in some ways, because the ISSB, for example, when did they come out with their standard and how's that going to apply? South Africa is a country that is an IFRS jurisdiction, so from the financial reporting perspective, so how does that then, what's the interplay and how's that going to work? What's going to be the position of the securities regulators? IOSCO, in our case, is exchanges, So those are some of the things we would need to monitor and see what makes sense harmoniously. And I think as any exchanges, any of us, would be concerned about saying you don't want kind of this arbitrage between jurisdictions where you got one jurisdiction saying mandatory, company saying I'm going to delist and go somewhere else, which is potentially what could happen. That I think is where there's a big conversation with the regulatory architecture within the country to understand what's appropriate. Not an answer in terms of timing, but maybe some appreciation of the challenges.
Well, it's good, but it also sounds like in South Africa, like in the U.S., the direction of travel is clear.
Absolutely.
So that's one way of thinking about it. So, Adrian, how long?
I think that there's two things that will make the process faster. And if you look at the lead that the UK government's taken in mandatory transition plan reporting, it shows how quickly things can move. You wouldn't have necessarily expected that to be happening as soon. So if we are able to integrate climate and nature-based reporting as much as possible. That will help because you've got to bleed from one into the other, and to expand that, it becomes a much more straightforward approach. I think so. The alignment of the way that risk information is disclosed on those two issues is going to be key, because it will increase engagement with disclosure, and it will increase the comfort of regulators in thinking about that. I think the other thing is that ultimately we need to stop looking at this, and many companies already are, as a kind of reporting regulatory burden. You know, the information that companies get from doing this work, from understanding the risks that they're exposed to, thinking about how they manage them better, and understanding the opportunities that are being created in the way their business run, they're huge commercial opportunities. Companies that get this right perform better on all sorts of levels because they understand they can attract better talent, because they can be more transparent about the way that they run, they can identify and innovate more quickly, and they can manage risk more effectively. And it applies as much to nature as it does to climate. So the more of those stories we can get out there, and the more successes we can see of companies benefiting rather than seeing it as a cost, I think will be really helpful in adoption rates. And again, that drives towards regulation following sooner.
Can I just add, just to his points, the one other benefit is the cost of capital that we're seeing. We're starting to see companies being able to achieve upside on the lower cost of capital as a consequence of better disclosure, better practices, and fundamentally changing those models. So those are big drivers for change anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, Harry, I want to let you answer this question and then have the last word as a member of the TNFD task force. So talk about when does this become regulatory, and if you want to wrap in the various different incentives.
Sure. So I think December, there is potentially a big moment, which is the Paris Agreement moment. Everyone keep their fingers crossed, of the nature and biodiversity world, and that's at COP15 in Montreal. And hopefully there will be an agreement to set certain global targets, which we do not have today in nature, amongst the parties, which are the governments. That's what we need. Now, secondly, the embedment of what, the more that we embed things into the existing international standards, like ISSB. And why I mention that? Because quite a number, IOSCO for one, has already said they're on the board of IFRS, and so they're going to be endorsing this as an international standard. So our market, for example, we already said as part of our mandatory climate-related disclosure, we will adopt ISSB over time as they come out in a manner that befits and is practical for the market. So the more you embed it into an international framework like that, the easier we believe it would be to roll this out. So those are two critical points in ensuring that, and of course, third point, the more that, this is part of the work that we're doing right now, the more that we can get consensus and clarity on what is a metric even to be looked at when we look at nature. There is no consensus on that. There's no consensus on the science behind this either. So the more we have consensus on these points, the easier it would be to get a mandatory adoption. The likes of NGFS, for macroprudential perspective, they're already looking at this. But it will take years, they also said. It will take a couple years. So the train has left, as you said. As a wrap-up, we think as a task force, it's very important to ensure that this framework caters for both the leaders who want to go faster, who want to embed the highest standards for their own company, for their own institution, as well as their markets. But also, as we were discussing, it's very important to ensure that this is adoptable on a global basis. And therefore, this split between core and enhance is, I think, going to be a game changer in allowing it to be adopted on a global basis so that different markets can go at their own pace. So there is more to come. It's a year, just short of a year, until the final standard comes out. And we're welcoming inputs from the various, it's open consultation right now, so please go to TNFD website.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Also thank you to WWF for your support for TNFD.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And thank you especially, I want to add my voice to that call for the Paris moment at the, what's called COP15, the meeting of the Convention on Biodiversity. in Montreal in December. Very, very important framework setting for the importance of nature. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Shamila. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. This has been a great conversation to help us all understand the role of exchanges in this systems level change in incorporating nature disclosures with climate disclosures and ultimately moving the real economy in a more net zero, nature positive direction. Thank you all very much for joining us on Finance Day here.